Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. My goal is what we've discussed today will be immediately actionable and useful to you, and I'd love to hear your comments for this episode about what you're planning on implementing. I'm very thankful to be joined today by Dr. Julia Sloan, who is the author of the definitive book, Learning to Think Strategically, which is now in its 4th edition. She's widely recognized for her pioneering work on the application of complex cognitive theory to everyday global strategic thinking practice. Her work draws upon more than 2 decades of her own corporate experience on multiple continents. She teaches at Columbia University and has lectured at some of the premier academic institutions in the world, including MIT, Harvard, and Princeton. Welcome to the program, Julia.
Thank you for having me.
So today's topic is going to be strategic thinking, and I think I found the right person to have that conversation with. So I'm so excited to get started with that. Tell us a little bit about your background and what got you interested on this topic.
Well, to be honest, what got me interested in this topic was pure accidental. My early background was actually in music. And then I was recruited for a corporation. I had no interest in business at all. And I took a lot of side roads. And once I landed in business, I was asked to very quickly to move over to the strategy side. I had no idea what strategy was, so I had to learn very quickly. And what I learned in addition to my role was that many other people didn't know what strategy was either. And our clients didn't know what it was. And I just noticed there was this huge disconnect between what was happening in the tip-top strategy offices and what was actually happening on the ground. And this was globally, and it irritated me. It confused me. And I just had no idea. So that was really the impetus in terms of my coming around to study strategic thinking. And I noticed that there were some people who were really good strategic thinkers and other people, a lot of other people, who seemed to be pretty clueless. And so I was very curious about how is it that these people who are really, really good, how is it they learn to get that way? How did they learn to think that way? And after my studies, I've done a good bit of research and wrote the book, and that's gone into subsequent editions. So it's a topic that I am just fascinated with. So I appreciate being able to share that today.
Wonderful. Thank you. And it's something that, based on our prior conversation, the need for it's even greater today, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I feel like in today's environment, more than any time, it's an environment of complexity. It's an environment of constant disruption, of unpredictability, of uncertainty. And during those sorts of times, people really do need to have knowledge and then experience in terms of what is strategy and what is strategic thinking and how do we learn it? Because I think when we understand how we learn something, it's much easier to develop it.
Wonderful. Well, let's start with that basic question. What is strategic thinking?
Well, let me start by saying it's not strategic planning, because I think the term strategic thinking has become a very trendy term. It's become a term that people tend to bat around in business circles, in public policy circles, and they often confuse it with strategic planning, strategic implementation, strategic leadership, strategic management. And it gets confused. And so strategic thinking, I have developed a very simple on the surface model that differentiates strategic thinking from strategic planning, from strategic implementation, based on the underlying kinds of thinking that are required for each.
Wonderful. Can you unpack that just a little bit as far as what really differentiates strategic thinking from those other two?
The intent of strategic thinking is actually not to problem solve, but rather to focus on the problem. So strategic thinking focuses on the problem. Do we have the real problem and do we have the right problem? Whereas strategic planning focuses on solutions. And strategic planning focuses on solution. That's very often where our start point is, where we just say, hey, I think we've got a problem. I think this is the problem. Come up with a strategy for it. Very often down the road, when we get to the implementation and people start having the strategy plopped on their desk and people are told, you need to go implement this, that they step back and they question it and they say, you know what, I'm happy to do my part, but this isn't the real problem. Or happy to do my part, but it's not the right problem. And that is an indicator of the absence of strategic thinking, where there's not been the questioning and the challenge and the poking holes in the strategy that could reveal early on we're a little bit off target or we're way off target. So strategic thinking, if I can just elaborate a little bit more here, we
Sure.
said the intent of strategic thinking is really to focus on the problem. Do we have the real problem and do we have the right problem? Strategic thinking by its nature tends to be informal. It doesn't tend to happen at work. It tends to happen when people are engaged in other kinds of things like gardening, like playing music, like painting, swimming, running, walks in the park, that sort of thing. So it tends to happen informally rather than formally like strategic planning does. It also tends to be a highly iterative, a very back and forth sort of a process. It also is highly emotional, highly intuitive, whereas strategic planning is very linear, rational, logical, analytical, and it's really pretty sequential. First we do this, then we do that, then we do this, then we do that. I would say another big difference to pay attention to between strategic thinking and strategic planning is that strategic thinking is really an ongoing and continuous process, whereas strategic planning ends with a product, which is your strategic plan. Strategic planning tends to be what I call seasonal. We'll usually spend a couple of months at some point during the year where we really focus on that strategic plan, whereas strategic thinking is really continuous and ongoing.
Thank you for unpacking that. That's really important to distinguish those two because you're right. Those two get mixed up a lot
Yeah.
in terms of what they are and what they're not. Now, in your book, which is a great book, it's not an easy read, but offers a lot of insight into how to think strategically. It's based off of a 7-year study that you did with executives to really learn how do they think strategically? What is the framework, the model that they use? So if you could let us know a little bit more about that study, then I'd love to go into those 3 steps at a high level, just to give our listeners some insight into what you learned from that study that's part of the book.
Sure, I'm happy to share this because it was really the findings were really very surprising for me, which is why I included them in a book. This 7-year study was really on senior level executives, C-suite executives. It was conducted with executives around the world, not just within North America, but around the world and across different industries. And a couple of the key findings, one is that strategic thinking tends to happen informally. This was so surprising for them to find out when things were all washed out. It was very surprising for me because I learned strategy as strategic planning and studied many, many different models and had no idea that this iterative approach, this informal approach, this very messy approach that does include a highly developed sense of intuition and that is highly emotional. Those were really new findings. Another thing was this use of previous experience and how previous experience really influences how we see new and how we give meaning to new experiences around strategy, giving new perspectives. I think knowing some of these sorts of things, particularly differentiating between strategic thinking and strategic planning, I find just having that piece of knowledge has been enormously helpful for executives because once they know what the differences are, they can catch themselves in terms of saying, what is my real intent? Is my real intent to poke holes in my strategy and to invite other people with very different perspectives to poke holes in my strategy? Or is my intent to really take this thing, plan it meticulously, and to get it rolled out. So it's like, do you want your mistakes to be revealed front end or back end? Is kind of what it boils down to.
I love those insights because you're right. That was one of the big surprises for me, that a lot of their strategic thinking was from non-work experiences in the past. And it's an informal process. And that informal process has 3 steps. So we're not going to be able to unpack all 3 in much depth. But that first stage is the preparation stage of a strategy. It consists of both an affective and a cognitive learning component. You've argued in your book, which I would agree with, is that the cognitive piece gets added emphasis when really it shouldn't, because it's the affective component that drives the thinking process forward, correct?
Yeah. This is again a new piece of information, and this was very insightful. I put this on pause for quite some time because I really wanted to test it and validate it over and over and over again because I didn't trust it. But strategy itself and strategic thinking itself is actually led by our intuition and emotion. And then we need to quickly pair that and partner that with strategic planning. As you go through the book, it's what I call, we need to start with that irrational cognitive cluster and move and partner and pair it tightly with the rational cognitive cluster. In other words, you don't just start by saying, it's strategy season, I guess I'd better make a strategy. We need to pay attention to our hunches. We need to pay attention to what are the problems we're facing. And that hunch is going to give us some indicator of what the problem is. So strategy itself needs to start with a problem, not a calendar year. And so once we start with that problem, then what we need to do is flesh it out and test it. Once we get it tested, then we move into the rational part, which is the analytics, the logical, linear piece of it. These two things work in tandem. They work back and forth. And good strategists really need to be very skillful at both pieces of it. And I find many, many times good strategists are very good at the analytical, rational, linear, logical thinking piece, but tend not to trust their intuition, usually because they just haven't learned how to trust their intuition. They haven't trusted the emotional piece because strategic planning tends to be devoid of any emotion, whereas strategic thinking is loaded with emotion, mainly fear.
So that's that first stage, the preparation stage of strategy. It moves into the second stage, which is the experience stage. So the experience stage is where we're looking at either a current experience or a prior successful life experience. And we're going to test this new experience against those. And we vacillate, you mentioned, between the two. We switch between the two quite frequently. Can you unpack that a little bit more and the importance that this stage plays in strategic thinking?
This is a stage that's very, very confusing. This is a stage that's highly emotional. It's very confusing, and we often want to get out of it as soon as possible. But I think when people realize and understand the role that the constructive role that tension can play in strategic thinking, they calm right down. They get comfortable with it and they say, okay, I get it. This is going to be tough. This is going to be really grappling with some really difficult stuff. And it is. So one of the things, again, a finding that came up, and one of the things that was really fun was listening to how people processed that very complex emotional piece. And what they did, interestingly, was use metaphor. And I think we often don't associate metaphor with business, anything, but it's very relevant to strategic thinking. So what people would tend to do, what these successful strategists would tend to do was they would rely on their past experience. For many of them, this was something like, it was always outside of work, but it was usually something like they were, playing in an orchestra, or they were coming up with an art exhibition. Many of them were very involved in the arts. And not that they did it full time, but they've learned it and they dabbled in it, and they drew on that as a cognitive reserve. Many of them drew upon gardening and farming, which was interesting. And so they would use that past experience when they would encounter a problem for business. So they would encounter a complex problem for business and they would immediately think, oh, that's just like something that happened before. And they would bounce back and forth. And that was very, very interesting. It was interesting to listen to them describe what their experiences were with that.
I'm reading from the book right now. A prior successful life experience is the foundation on which we learn to make good strategy. It is the accumulation of experience that eventually becomes our tacit knowledge or our autopilot setting. And the executives that were interviewed stated that the most important experience that influenced their learning to make strategy was a prior successful experience, and that it occurred in a non-business setting. That's really surprising to me, because in B schools and in what we thought of as a good strategic thinker, they have the model, they have the structure, they have all of this in place, and that's what makes them good. But your findings, your study was contradicting that.
Yeah, and I think the models definitely have a place. But when we're talking about strategy, when we're talking about setting direction, we're talking about the importance of pattern recognition. And when people see a problem that looks like, or it reminds them of, or it resembles a problem that they've had in the past, okay, maybe it may be with business, it may not be with business. But when they see that problem and they think, what did I do in that situation? Or what was the consequence of my action in that situation? It triggers a much more vivid impulse than if they're just saying, what does the model, the model that I used in Japan must apply to this model that I'm using in Peru. It may or may not. So this whole use of metaphor itself is a great cognitive integrative tool that pulls conceptual thinking, complex thinking, framing and reframing. It really pulls all of that together in a way that is beautiful. And I'll tell you another thing that was interesting that came up was how these executives used not only metaphor, but drawing and imagery of their metaphor as a memory recognition tool, and also to be able to deal with conceptual thinking as well as concrete thinking. So those are really interesting findings. They're things that we all have access to. We just don't know that they're valuable, I think.
I think now we should know that they're valuable because of this study. But what if someone doesn't have any experiences? Can they use the experiences of others from what they've read, seen, secondhand experiences? Are those valuable as well in using those as reference points when you're becoming a better strategic thinker, or is it really the firsthand experiences you need to have?
Well, firsthand experiences are always going to have a bigger dose of emotion, and they're going to have a bigger impact in terms of memory retention, in terms of memory transfer, in terms of pattern recognition. But it's interesting, and I think this is one of the values that executives get of sharing experiences, that when I listen to somebody else's experience unfold, what I'm listening for is patterns. Do they make sense with the experiences that I'm having? How similar or dissimilar are they to the experiences I'm having? And I think that this is especially relevant today when there's so much disruption, there's so much confusion, there's so much unpredictability, that people need a way of tracking what happened to me in this situation, what's happened to me in another situation.
Now, the third part of the process is that reevaluation stage, and it's that reflection. But reflection is really critical throughout all three stages. And I think that's one piece that a lot of executives these days, managers as well, they don't have the time to sit back, to pause, and to reflect. And that's really an issue and a weakness that's going to have long-term repercussions. So if you could just tell us a little bit more about the reevaluation stage, and if you could unpack a little bit of that reflection process.
I think this third reevaluation process is often short circuited. It's actually kind of snipped off and thrown away, kind of cast aside. It's critically important. This is where we validate our decision making, also where we validate variables and factors and the impact and consequences that factors have had. So we need to set aside time to do this. And the reflection time itself can certainly happen after work, out of work. In fact, it does whether you tell people it does or not. It tends to happen outside when people are riding bike, when people are fishing, when people are taking a walk, right before sleep, right after, in the shower. Okay, is when this kind of thing happens. My recommendation too, when we talk about the necessity of critical reflection in strategic thinking, it's so important to realize that we're talking about critical inquiry, which is inviting people to ask you tough questions. When it's invite critical inquiry, inviting people to ask you questions that really shift and shatter the frames that you're looking at the problem through. Critical reflection, critical dialogue, engaging with people who have opinions that may be so far fetched, that may be so different than yours, is also so important because when you are engaged in a critical dialogue, you don't need to respond and you don't need to get combative and you don't need to justify. All you need to do is engage in a sharing, pack it up and go home and start to critically reflect on this. So there's really the critical reflection, the critical inquiry, and the critical dialogue, those three pieces that I think every senior executive who is responsible for strategy really needs to get disciplined in the rigor of critical reflection, critical dialogue, and critical inquiry if they're going to be successful strategic thinkers.
Very well said. And yeah, within this last stage of the informal learning process, reflection is really used, right, to review the action and decisions and provide the rationale for those decisions created during the experience stage. And it's that combination in this stage of you act, you think, and then you act again in that cycle. So it's so critical to have these three pieces. I love how you put them together, and it provides a nice framework for leaders to say, okay, here's what I need to do to get better at thinking strategically. And we've given some insights into each one of those stages. And I wanted to now move to some of the attributes that you've identified that are critical to learning to think strategically. And there's 5 of them. We'll touch upon them briefly, but critical ones. First one, in no order really, is having an imagination. And so, why do you think having an imagination is critical to thinking strategically?
There's just a huge piece of strategic thinking that relies on creativity. I like to say, just as an easy kind of a thing to remember, the strategic thinking is comprised of what I call the 2 Ds: divergent thinking and deep dive thinking. And creativity contributes to both of those. The fortunate thing is we're all born with creativity. Sometimes we just forget we have it. So it's something that we need to tap into.
That divergent thinking is so important versus convergent thinking, which a lot of us are much better at. And you're right, creativity plays a big role in this whole process. The second attribute is having a broad perspective. Can you unpack that a little bit? How do we broaden our perspectives?
This is a huge attribute, something that's so important to focus on and to develop. I like to say developing a broad perspective, if you kind of think of it in terms of strategic thinking as having 2 pieces. One is altitude. What's the altitude at which you're looking at this problem? And again, you can see how visual this is. What's the altitude? It requires a little bit of training. It requires a little bit of practice in terms of saying, I don't know what the altitude is. And it's like, find out, draw, and find out what is the altitude. Because a lot of times what happens with our so-called strategy sessions is we define the strategy problem as like a little bird on the forest floor where we're just rummaging around on the forest floor and we just latch on to whatever is closest to us or whatever's in our way. And I think that's important to note. So then take that and build on it to say, what would happen if I changed the altitude? What happens if I perched myself up on a higher branch? And what would happen if I perched myself on an even higher branch? This is where you get agility of thought, is changing the altitude and being aware and being very conscious and very deliberate and sharing the altitude at which you're looking at the problem. People need to know, are you aware of how you're seeing the problem? Or am I aware of that I'm looking at the problem from a very different altitude? So altitude is one thing to help broaden perspective. The other thing is longevity. What's the time frame that you're looking at the problem? Are you looking at the problem as being something within the next 6 months, within the next 2 years, which is pretty typical, within the next 10 years, within the next 100 years. So, what's the altitude at which I'm viewing the problem? And then what's the longevity? If you look at the, kind of focus on those two things, I think you'll have a much better sense of what it is you need to develop in terms of a broad perspective.
Wonderful. Thank you. The next one is, which I see this is a really a critical one these days, is the ability to juggle or attend to competing, incomplete, or inaccurate information all at once. Can you unpack that a little bit and maybe give some insight or some tools around how to be better at that?
It's huge. A lot of people think that juggling means multitasking. It doesn't. If you're a leader, your number one task is setting strategy, and strategic thinking is a critical piece of that. So you need to get comfortable with the idea of juggling a lot of incomplete information. You can't just say, well, this is incomplete or this is inaccurate. I have to wait until I get accurate information. That's probably not going to be ever. One of the ways that we can get accustomed to that is by paying attention to the tension that we're feeling, because a real strategic issue is always going to be jam-packed with tension. And there's a particular type of tension that it's packed with, and it's what I call in the book and polarity thinking. And polarity is when we have to do two things at the same time, and not just two things at the same time, but two things that work in opposition to each other. That creates just huge tension, but it's an indicator of a real strategic problem. There's lots and lots of exercises that you can do to begin to pay attention to. Do I have a real and polarity here? It's something that when I work with senior executives, whether it's public policy or whether it's corporate, this is one of the first steps, is being able to identify, do I have a real strategic issue? How would I know? Let's find the and polarity to it and feel that tension and realize the tension can be of huge service in terms of coming up with an innovative strategy.
Thank you. Love that. Great tool as well. The next one is the ability to deal with things over which you have no control, which might be counterintuitive for some because they've been trained possibly to think of and focus on only the things in which they are in control of. Why is this important?
Oh, this is such a good point, Charles, because in strategic, we're going back to the triangle model that I use. For strategic planning, what we really want to keep a tight focus on is things that I can control. For strategic thinking, because of the nature of strategic thinking, we want to pay attention to things I cannot control. Okay. And you look at the environment today that is filled with complex problems. We need to focus on what can't I control and realize that from a strategic perspective, it's usually the stuff that we can't control that are going to pull out the rug from us from a strategic perspective. Things that I can control, that I slip up on, that I forget about, that I make a mistake on, those are usually correctable. We can usually rectify those things. But it's the things that I cannot control, like, for example, forest fires, an economy that you have absolutely no control over, social unrest that can upset and impact everything else, political unrest and political discord that impacts the economy, that impacts social issues, that impacts just about everything else. These are things I can't control. These are things no business leader can control. But these are the things that can undermine and really pull the rug out from us from a strategic perspective. So we need to give time to these sorts of things, even though at the time it may seem like a far-fetched conversation where people roll their eyeballs and think, oh, we'll never have a hurricane here. Oh, we'll never have a tornado. We'll never have a tsunami. We'll never have. These are the things that can really wreak havoc on a business because we haven't considered them. So that's why it's important as an attribute to be able to develop an ability to use our imagination to diverge an issue and to say, well, what could happen? And what would it take if it did happen?
Those are some great insights. The fifth and final critical attribute you mentioned by all executives interviewed was a strong desire to win. And this is one where you make a case that this was necessary for driving strategic thinking forward. And it's connected to all the other attributes because it's this desire to win that was perceived by executives as a motivator and tying them all together. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, it's so funny with desire to win. It's really a fierce, compelling desire to win. It's not just that strategy is part of my job, so that's why I'm doing it. It's this emotional piece. It's the emotion piece that is driving this. So I think that this desire to win, if you're talking about looking at talent and talent management, you want to really find some ways to engage in conversation to sort of test for who are these people who really have a fierce desire to win, because business is not just about a place to go or a thing to do. It's really about winning. And what that looks like in every industry and in every business can look very different. But there has to be this emotional determination to give as much as you've got and then some in terms of being able to achieve a really good long-term win. So it's something to test for and something to check for.
Wonderful. Thank you. As we reach the end of this episode, I just like to pose one final question to my guest. And in this case, love for you to answer the question that what would you want leaders listening to this call to think about regarding strategic thinking and the importance that it plays and what it takes to develop it?
I would love for people to take away two different domains of thinking that are required of real strategic thinkers, that we need both. Both, strategic thinking and strategic planning are both so necessary. But the kinds of thinking that support them are totally different and actually can cancel each other out. So I'd love to believe that people would take away that there is value to this irrational cluster of thinking that supports strategic thinking, which includes informal thinking, highly intuitive thinking, irrational thinking. It's full of emotion, and that it tends to happen best when we're in a state of disequilibrium. I think the rational part, the strategic planning part, the analytical, logical, linear, rational thinking piece, I think we're all pretty good at that. If not, there's plenty of formal education that's available to become good at that. It's the irrational piece, the strategic thinking piece, that I think we need to really pay attention to and to begin to trust ourselves that if we learn the vocabulary, if we learn the concepts, a lot of what happens is we say, you know what, I can do that. I can learn that. I don't have to go back to school and get 6 PhDs to do that. I've already got what it takes to do that, and to trust yourself that you can, because strategic thinking is learnable. A lot of people think that for some reason that you're born with it or you're not. It's learnable. And I'd love for listeners to take that away.
I love that as well. And I definitely agree with you. Thank you so much, Julia, for joining me on this episode. And remind our listeners, is there a way to get a hold of you or contact you?
So I'm on LinkedIn at Julia Sloan, and also on my website, which is sloaninternationalconsulting.com. And I'd be happy to talk further with anybody who's interested in this topic. Thank you. Thanks so much, Charles.
Thank you, Julia. This concludes this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. If you like what you heard today, please share this with your colleagues and friends and anyone else who might find this valuable. If you'd like to subscribe, this podcast can be found both on Apple and Spotify, and can also be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. And until next time, remember, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.